The letter arrived smelling of lavender and grief, folded around a house key that didn't fit any lock I owned. I stood in the doorway of my grandmother's kitchen with that key pressed into my palm so hard the teeth left a mark, and I understood, before I read a single word, that my sister was gone. Rena Ball had always been the reckless one. I was the steady one, the one who stayed home and pruned the apple trees and paid the water bill on time, while Ren chased storms and fell in love with things she wasn't supposed to touch. I should have known that the last thing she touched would be a Marshall. The letter was in her handwriting, looping and hurried, the ink smudged in places like she'd been crying while she wrote it, or laughing, or both. She told me about a man named Desmond. She told me they'd been meeting in the old grove between our two properties for over a year, in the shadow of the very fence line our families had been arguing about since before either of us was born. She told me they'd married in secret, 3 months ago, in a courthouse 2 counties over, with no family and no rings. Just a borrowed suit and a wildflower bouquet she'd picked from the ditch outside. She told me she was happy. She told me she was scared. She told me that if anything ever happened to her, there was a baby, and the baby's name was Juniper, and the baby needed both families, not just mine, because love shouldn't have to hide the way hers had. Then she told me the accident. Not in those words. She never got the chance to write those words herself. That part came from the sheriff. 3 days later, in a phone call I took standing in the same doorway, still holding the same key. A truck. Black ice on the county road. Desmond had been driving her and the baby home from a checkup. He didn't survive either. Ren held on for 11 hours in a hospital bed before her heart simply stopped trying. The baby, not yet 2 months old, had been in a rear-facing seat, buckled in with the kind of obsessive care new parents have, and she walked away without a scratch on her, screaming into a world that had already broken in half around her. I don't remember driving to the hospital. I remember the smell of antiseptic and the sound of my own boots on linoleum, and I remember a nurse handing me a bundle of blankets with more care than I felt I deserved, because my hands were shaking too badly to hold anything precious. I remember looking down into a small, furious face, red and scrunched and utterly unaware of the war she'd been born into, and feeling something in my chest crack open like river ice in April. I also remember looking up from that face and seeing him for the first time. He was standing on the other side of the nursery window, tall, in a way that made the hallway feel smaller, dark hair pushed back from a face that hadn't slept in days, eyes rimmed red, the same as mine must have been. He had his brother's jaw, I would learn later, and his mother's eyes, and in that moment, none of that mattered, because all I saw was a Marshall standing where a Marshall had no right to stand. Looking at a baby that half of my blood had made. "That's my niece," he said. His voice cracked on the word niece, like he wasn't sure he'd earned it yet. "She's my sister's daughter," I answered, and I heard the challenge in my own voice even though I hadn't meant to put it there. Grief does that. It puts blades in your hands before you've decided to pick them up. We stood like that for a long moment, 2 strangers who shared a dead love story between us, each of us holding half a claim to the same small life. Somewhere behind him, a Marshall elder was already on the phone with a lawyer. Somewhere behind me, my grandmother was doing the same. Neither of us knew yet that the next year of our lives would be decided not by love, not by grief, but by a family court judge with tired eyes and no patience left for century-old feuds. His name, I learned before the sun rose again, was Frank Marshall, and God help me, I would spend the rest of my life tangled up in the sound of it. The feud between the Balls and the Marshalls was old enough that nobody alive could tell you the whole true shape of it anymore, only the pieces that had been sharpened into weapons and handed down. My grandmother told one version over strong coffee and stronger opinions. A Marshall ancestor had dammed the creek that fed our orchard back when orchards and vineyards both depended on that thin silver ribbon of water. And half our trees had died black and brittle before anyone thought to take him to court. Frank's father told a different version, I would learn later. One where a Ball ancestor had stolen a bride promised to a Marshall son, and the dammed creek had only ever been retaliation, not the original sin. The truth, probably, was some tangled combination of both, softened and sharpened by 100 years of grudges being retold at funerals and weddings and holiday tables. What mattered, in the practical sense, was this. Our two properties shared a fence line 2 miles long, our two families had not spoken a civil word across it in living memory, and now we shared a baby. The court hearing happened 9 days after the funeral. I wore a suit that had belonged to my father, too broad in the shoulders, and I sat on one side of a gray room with my grandmother's hand gripping mine hard enough to bruise. Frank sat on the other side with his father, Garrick Marshall, a man built like a fence post and twice as unyielding, and I remember thinking that Frank looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. The judge, a woman named Corinne Alvarez, who I would come to be deeply grateful for, listened to both families present their case for sole custody. She listened to my grandmother describe our orchard, our stability, the nursery already half built in the room that had been Wren's as a girl. She listened to Garrick Marshall describe the vineyard, the Marshall Trust Fund set aside for Desmond's children the day he was born, the belief that a Marshall child belonged under a Marshall roof. Then Judge Alvarez set down her pen and said something that changed the entire shape of my life. "I have read the letter Renabal wrote to her brother," she said, "and I have read the letter Desmond Marshall left with his own attorney, which says, nearly word for word, the same thing. Two parents, independently, in the final months of their lives, expressed the same wish. Not that their daughter belonged to one family, that she belonged to both. I don't often get to honor a dying wish this clearly stated, and I don't intend to ignore it because the adults in this room have inherited a grudge that predates all of them." She ordered joint legal and physical custody, alternating weeks to start with a review in 6 months, and a firm recommendation delivered in a tone that left no room for argument, that both families attend family counseling together if they wanted this arrangement to survive the child's infancy without causing her lasting harm. My grandmother's hand went rigid in mine. Across the room, Garrick Marshall's jaw worked like he was chewing on something bitter. And Frank looked, for one unguarded second, relieved. Like some part of him had wanted exactly this and hadn't dared to hope for it. Our eyes met across the gray room, over the heads of our furious elders, and something passed between us that I didn't have a name for yet. Not friendship, not yet trust. Something more like recognition. Two people who'd been handed the same impossible, precious weight, and neither of us willing to drop it. "We'll need to work out logistics," Frank said to me afterward in the hallway, while our families glared at each other from opposite ends of the corridor, like dogs straining against leashes. "Feeding schedules, doctor's appointments, all of it." "I know how to raise a child," I said, more sharply than I meant to, because I was tired and grieving and terrified of loving something I might lose. Something flickered across his face, quick and wounded, gone before I could name it. "I didn't say you didn't," he said quietly. "I said we'll need to work it out. Together, that's what she wanted, both of them wanted." I looked down at my hands, at my father's suit hanging loose on my frame, and I felt shame crawl up the back of my neck. "You're right," I said. "I'm sorry." He held out his hand, the first civil gesture a marshal had offered a ball in 3 generations, and I remember how strange it felt to take it, how his palm was warm and his grip was careful. Like he already understood there was something fragile between us that neither of us wanted to break. "Truce," he said. "For her sake." "Truce," I echoed, and I told myself that was all it would ever be. I was already lying to myself. I just didn't know it yet. The first handoff happened on a Sunday evening at the fence line, because neither family would agree to cross onto the other's property, and Frank suggested the gate near the old grove as neutral ground before either of our grandparents could object. I remember standing there with a diaper bag over one shoulder and Juniper asleep in her car seat watching Frank Marshall walk toward me across land that had been disputed for 100 years, and thinking that he moved like someone who'd spent his whole life being careful not to take up too much space. "She ate at 4, I told him, handing over the printed schedule I'd typed up the night before, color-coded, laminated even, because grief had turned into a need to control something, anything. She likes the mobile with the moons better than the one with the stars. She hates the purple pacifier for reasons no one alive understands. Frank took the paper with both hands like it was something precious. Noted, he said, and the corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, more like the ghost of one that hadn't been allowed out in a while. I made one too. He held out his own paper, and I unfolded it to find his handwriting blockier than mine, listing out feeding times, and a note that said, "She likes to be walked, not rocked when she's fussy. Don't ask me why." Des figured it out, and I never questioned it. Reading his dead brother's name in his handwriting did something to my chest that I wasn't prepared for. I looked up and found Frank watching Juniper's sleeping face instead of me, his jaw tight, his eyes wet in the fading light. "You miss him," I said. It wasn't a question. "Every hour," he answered, so simply that it cracked something open in me too. "You miss her the same way." "Every hour," I agreed. We stood there for a moment, two grieving strangers bound by a sleeping baby and 100 years of inherited hate, and something about the honesty of it made the whole ridiculous feud feel very far away and very small. The weeks that followed found their own rhythm, the way water finds the low ground even through rock. I would drop Juniper off at the gate on a Sunday, and Frank would hand her back the following week, and slowly, without either of us deciding to, the handoffs stopped being transactions and started being conversations. He told me about his brother, about how Desmond had been the golden son of the Marshall Vineyard, the one who was supposed to inherit everything, and instead had fallen in love with a ball girl in a fruit grove, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I told him about Wren, about how she used to sneak out of our grandmother's house through the kitchen window, about the year she decided she wanted to be a marine biologist and filled her bedroom with fish tanks until our grandmother made her choose between the fish and her allowance. "She sounds like she was never going to stay inside the lines anyone drew for her," Frank said one evening, leaning against the fence post with Juniper's diaper bag slung over one broad shoulder. And there was something like admiration in his voice that made my throat tighten. "She wasn't," I agreed. "I used to envy that about her. I always stayed inside the lines. Every single one." Frank looked at me then, really looked, in a way that made the evening air feel warmer than it had any right to be in late autumn. "Maybe that's why she trusted you with this," he said, nodding toward Juniper's car seat between us. "Somebody needed to stay inside the lines. Somebody needed to make sure there was still solid ground for her daughter to stand on." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing, and he didn't seem to need me to. We just stood there in the deepening blue of the evening, close enough that I could smell wood smoke and cedar on his jacket, close enough that when our hands both reached for the same strap on the car seat, our fingers brushed and neither of us pulled away as quickly as good sense would have suggested. Before I went inside, Frank caught my wrist, gentle, almost hesitant, as if he weren't quite sure the gesture was allowed yet. "Can I ask you something that isn't about schedules or fever charts?" he said. "You can ask me anything," I said, and meant it more than I expected to. "Do you ever wonder what they'd think of us?" he said, nodding toward the darkened grove beyond the fence. "Doing this, standing here every week like it's ordinary, like there was never anything to forgive." I thought about it honestly before answering, the way the question deserved. "I think Wren would be insufferable about it," I said finally. "I think she'd say she told me so, about something, though I couldn't tell you what yet. And I think your brother would probably just be relieved that someone finally finished what he started." Frank huffed out a soft laugh, the sound settling something uneasy in his chest that I could almost see loosen. "That's probably exactly what they'd say," he agreed. "Both of them. Both of them." He let go of my wrist then, slow and reluctant, and for a moment neither of us moved, caught in the strange gravity that had been building between us for weeks without either of us naming it. It would be a little longer yet before we let ourselves close that last small distance for good. But standing there in the cooling dark watching him walk back across the fence line toward his own porch light, I already knew with a certainty that frightened me a little, that some part of me was going to spend every week from then on simply waiting for Sunday. That night, I lay awake in my childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling, and admitted to myself for the first time that I was in serious trouble. Not the kind of trouble a lawyer could fix. The kind that starts in your chest and spreads. 6 weeks in Juniper, got a fever in the middle of my custody week. And I did what any terrified new guardian does at 2 in the morning. I called the only other person on earth who loved her as much as I did. Frank arrived at my door in 20 minutes flat, hair disheveled, jacket thrown on over pajama pants, looking like he'd broken every speed limit on the county road to get there. He didn't ask permission to come inside a ball house for the first time in 3 generations of Marshalls. He just walked straight to the nursery, scooped Juniper out of my shaking arms, and pressed the back of his hand to her burning forehead with the calm competence of someone who had clearly done this before. 101, he said. That's within range, but we should call the pediatrician's after-hours line just to be safe. Do you have infant fever reducer? I did not have infant fever reducer. I had a color-coded feeding schedule and a laminated pacifier preference chart and absolutely no idea how to handle an actual crisis. And something about the gap between my careful preparation and my complete uselessness in the moment made me start laughing a little hysterically right there in the nursery doorway. "What's funny?" Frank asked, though there was warmth in his voice, not judgment. "I typed up a schedule for what pacifier she likes," I said, wiping at my eyes, not entirely sure anymore if I was laughing or crying, and I don't have children's medicine in the house. Frank huffed out something that was almost a laugh too, and it eased the fear knotted in my chest just slightly. "I've got some in the truck. Force of habit. Des always said I overpacked the diaper bag." His voice caught on his brother's name the way it always did, a small hitch he tried to smooth over quickly. We spent the next 2 hours on the living room floor together. Juniper cradled between us on a nest of blankets while we waited for the fever to break, trading soft words with the pediatric nurse on speakerphone and then with each other, once the professional reassurance had done its job and the fear started to loosen its grip. Frank told me about the Marshall vineyard, about how his father had never quite forgiven him for not being the son who fell in love recklessly, for being the steady one who stayed and worked the land instead. I told him it was strange to hear that, because everyone in my family had always said the same thing about me, that I was the reliable ball, the one who stayed, while Ren was the one who ran toward everything with open arms. "Maybe that's why the two of us keep circling each other like this," Frank said low, watching Juniper's small chest rise and fall and sleep between us. "We're the ones who got left behind to hold everything together, while the reckless ones got to have their storybook romance." "That's a bitter way to put it," I said, though it wasn't wrong, and some old ugly feeling I hadn't let myself examine too closely rose up in my throat. "I don't mean it bitterly," Frank said, and when I looked at him, his eyes were soft, steady, fixed on me with an intensity that made my pulse stutter. "I mean, I think I understand you. Better than I expected to, given everything our families taught us to feel about each other." The fire in the hearth popped and settled. Juniper slept on between us, oblivious to the current running through the room, and I found myself unable to look away from Frank Marshall's face in the low orange light from the exhausted tenderness in his expression, from the way his hand rested so carefully near his niece's small fist without quite touching mine. "I don't hate you," I admitted quietly, like it was a confession that cost me something. "I thought I would. I think I was supposed to." "I don't hate you either," Frank said. "I think I was supposed to, too." Neither of us moved to close the distance between us that night, but something had shifted, some old wall cracked, and I fell asleep on that living room floor with the strange new knowledge that I had started without meaning to, without wanting to look forward to Sundays at the fence line more than any other day of the week. Quick pause here. If you want to watch our videos early with 0 ads or get access to exclusive videos, our Patreon has you covered, link in the description. All right, back to where things get interesting. 3 months into our arrangement, Frank found the letters. He called me on a Tuesday evening, his voice tight in a way I'd learned to recognize as barely contained emotion, and asked if I could come to the Marshall property just this once, just for this. My grandmother would have had something sharp to say about a ball setting foot on Marshall land, But my grandmother wasn't there, and I found I didn't much care anymore what the old feud demanded of me. He met me at the edge of the vineyard, in the fading gold of early evening, and led me without a word to a small stone shed near the tasting room that had apparently been Desmond's private workspace. Inside, in a locked drawer Frank had finally found the key for, were dozens of letters, some addressed to Wren and never sent, some clearly written by her and kept by Desmond like treasure. "I thought you should see these," Frank said, his voice rough. "They're yours as much as they're his, as much as they're mine." I sat on an overturned crate in that stone shed and read my sister's handwriting, described falling in love with a marshal, the way you'd describe falling in love with a hurricane, terrifying and inevitable and impossible to regret. She wrote about the grove between the properties, about stolen hours, about a plan someday to bring both families together to end the fighting, not with a grand gesture, but with something small and ordinary. A baby who belonged to both sides equally and could not be divided by an old grudge, no matter how hard anyone tried. I found one letter from Desmond, unfinished, that made my throat close entirely. He'd written to his future daughter, whoever she turned out to be, telling her that her mother was the bravest person he'd ever loved, and that if anything ever happened to either of them, he trusted his brother Frank to make sure she grew up knowing both families loved her without condition, without the weight of a war she never chose. I looked up from that letter to find Frank watching me, his own eyes wet, his shoulders bowed under a grief that mirrored my own, so exactly it startled me every time I noticed it fresh. "He trusted you," I said softly. "With everything. With her." "He trusted us," Frank corrected, and stepped closer, close enough that I had to tilt my head back to hold his gaze. "Both of us. That's what this was always supposed to be. Not a war anymore, Elmer. Something else." My name in his mouth did something dangerous to my composure. I stood up from the crate letters still clutched in one hand and found myself close enough to Frank Marshall that I could count the faint freckles across the bridge of his nose. Close enough to feel the warmth radiating off him in the cooling evening air. "I keep telling myself this is only about her," I admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "That whatever I feel when I see you is just gratitude, relief that I'm not doing this alone." "Is that what you tell yourself?" Frank murmured, and it wasn't quite a question. "It's a lie," I said. "I know it's a lie. I've known for weeks." Frank's hand came up, slow, giving me every chance to step away, and cupped the side of my face with a gentleness that undid something I'd been holding together by sheer stubbornness since the day of the funeral. "Then stop telling it," he said. "Please, I'm tired of pretending too. I don't remember deciding to close the last few inches between us. I only remember the letters slipping from my fingers to the dusty floor of that stone shed, and Frank Marshall's mouth finding mine soft and certain in the fading light. And the sensation of 100 years of inherited hatred simply dissolving into something warm and quiet and entirely our own. When we finally broke apart, foreheads resting together, both of us breathing like we'd run a great distance, Frank laughed, low and disbelieving. "My father would disown me. My grandmother would burn the orchard down," I said, and found I was smiling too, despite everything, or maybe because of everything. "Worth it?" Frank asked, only half joking, searching my face for the answer. I thought of Wren's handwriting describing a hurricane she couldn't regret. I thought of Desmond's unfinished letter to a daughter he never got to raise. I thought of every Sunday evening at that fence line that I'd started living for without admitting why. "Worth it," I said, and kissed him again to prove I meant it. We kept it quiet at first, the way people do when something is too new and too precious to survive being handled by other people's opinions. For 6 weeks, Frank and I existed in a private world bordered by fence posts and old grudges stealing time in the grove where our siblings had once stolen their own. Learning each other in the small, unremarkable ways that turn out to matter most. I learned that he took his coffee black and hated it, drinking it anyway out of some misplaced sense of discipline, until I started making it for him with cream and sugar, and he stopped protesting after the second cup. He learned that I couldn't sleep without noise, some leftover habit from a childhood spent listening for Wren's window sliding open, and he started leaving a radio playing low in whichever house Juniper and I were staying in that week, tuned to whatever station played old country songs about heartbreak and second chances. Juniper grew the way babies do astonishingly fast, and somewhere in those 6 weeks she started smiling on purpose instead of by reflex, and the first time she smiled at both of us together at the fence line. In the golden hour before sunset, I looked over at Frank and saw my own wonder mirrored exactly on his face. "She doesn't know to hate anybody yet," Frank said quietly, brushing one finger against her small curled fist. "She just knows we both show up." "I want to keep it that way," I said, "for as long as we possibly can." Judge Alvarez's recommendation for family counseling had not been optional, not really, and so once a week, Frank and I drove together to a small office above the pharmacy in town, where a counselor named Priya Nandakumar listened to two grown men try to untangle 100 years of inherited grievance, one Thursday afternoon at a time. I resented it at first, sitting stiff in an uncomfortable chair, while a stranger asked me to describe my earliest memory of hearing the word Marshall spoken like a curse. But Frank showed up every week without fail, answering the same hard questions with the same careful honesty, and somewhere around the 6th or 7th session, I stopped resenting the process and started, cautiously, trusting it. "Tell me about the fence," Priya said one afternoon, her notebook open on her knee. Her eyes moving between us with the patient attention of someone who had clearly heard 100 versions of the same old story and still found each one worth listening to properly. "Not the legal boundary. The actual, physical fence." "What does it mean to each of you?" Frank answered first, his hands loosely clasped between his knees. "Growing up, that fence meant the edge of the world I was allowed to want anything from," he said. "My father used to say the balls would take whatever they could reach across it, so we were taught never to reach back. I used to stand at that fence line as a kid and wonder what was so terrible on the other side that nobody would even let me look. I found, to my own surprise, that my throat had gone tight listening to him." "For me, it was the opposite," I said, when Priya's gaze moved to me. "My grandmother used to say the fence was the only thing standing between our water and their greed. I grew up thinking of it as something that protected us. It never once occurred to me that it might have been keeping something good out instead of something bad." "And now?" Priya asked, looking between us. "What does the fence mean to the two of you now?" Frank reached over without hesitation and took my hand, right there in that small office above the pharmacy, and I let him, because some old instinct to hide had finally, quietly, stopped mattering more than the truth. "Now it's just the place I go every Sunday to hand my daughter to the man I love," he said. It stopped being a wall a long time before either of us admitted it out loud. Priya smiled, the first unguarded smile I'd seen from her in 7 sessions, and made a small note in her book. "That," she said, "is exactly the kind of progress this process is meant to produce. I want you both to notice it, not just here, at home, at the fence line itself. Notice when the old story tries to reassert itself, and notice, deliberately, when you choose the new one instead." We left that session and drove back toward the valley in a comfortable, contented silence, the autumn light slanting gold across the windshield. And somewhere on that drive, Frank reached over and laced his fingers through mine on the console between us, and I thought, not for the first time, that healing rarely announces itself with any great drama. Mostly, it just looks like two people quietly choosing, over and over, not to flinch away from each other anymore. It couldn't last forever, that gentle, private unfolding, of course. Secrets rarely do in families that have spent a century watching each other for weakness. My grandmother found out first, from a neighbor who'd seen Frank's truck parked in our driveway 2 evenings in a row, well past any hour that could be explained by custody logistics. She confronted me in the kitchen with her arms crossed and her jaw set in the particular way that meant she'd already decided how this conversation would end before it began. "Tell me it isn't true," she said. "Tell me you haven't gone and fallen for a Marshall on top of everything else this family has already lost to them." "I haven't lost anything to Frank," I said, and my voice shook only a little. "Ren didn't lose anything either. She found something. I understand that now." My grandmother's face went through something complicated, grief and fury and old fear all tangled together before settling into something flatter, harder. "That family took your sister from us," she said. "That family gave me my niece," I said back. "And a man I'm in love with, if you want the whole truth of it, since we're finally being honest at this table." She didn't speak to me for 4 days after that. Frank fared worse. His father found out the same week, from Frank himself, in a conversation Frank later described to me in a voice so carefully controlled I could tell it had cost him everything to keep it that steady. Garrick Marshall had looked at his surviving son and told him that he'd already buried one boy for loving a ball, and he wasn't sure his heart could survive burying the family name over a second one doing the same. Even if this time no one was dying, only disgracing everything 4 generations had built. "He didn't say he'd disown me," Frank told me that night, sitting on my porch steps with Juniper's monitor crackling faintly through the screen door behind us. "He just went quiet. I think that might be worse." "I think I would rather," he shouted. I reached over and took his hand, lacing our fingers together in the dark, and felt him grip back hard enough to ache. "We knew this part would be hard," I said. "We didn't know it yet, but we knew." "Is it worth it?" Frank asked again, the same question from the stone shed, but quieter this time, more frightened, less sure of the answer. "Every single time you ask me that," I said, "the answer gets more true, not less." He turned to look at me then, and in the porch light I could see the exhaustion and the hope warring across his face in equal measure, and I understood with sudden clarity. That loving Frank Marshall was never going to be the easy kind of love. It was going to cost us both something. But I had already decided somewhere in that stone shed, with my sister's letters scattered at my feet, that I would rather pay that cost than live the rest of my life the way our families had taught us to. Careful and small and armored against the one thing that might have healed us both. The 6-month review hearing arrived faster than either of us was ready for, and with it came the crisis neither of us had seen coming. Garrick Marshall petitioned the court for sole custody, citing what his attorney called an inappropriate and destabilizing relationship between the child's 2 guardians, framing our romance not as the healing his own son had died wanting, but as a scandal that would harm Juniper's future, confuse her sense of family, and violate the spirit of the original custody arrangement. My grandmother, to my genuine shock and lasting gratitude, did not join him. She sat in the back of the courtroom with her purse in her lap and her mouth pressed into a thin, unhappy line. But she did not testify against me, and afterwards she told me only that she still didn't understand it. But she'd read her granddaughter's letter enough times to know what Wren had actually wanted, and she wasn't about to be the one who stood in the way of it twice. Frank looked wrecked in the courtroom, sitting apart from his father for the first time in the entire proceeding, his hands clasped so tightly in his lap the knuckles had gone white. When his attorney asked him directly whether his relationship with me had compromised his ability to co-parent responsibly, I watched him take a long breath before answering. "My relationship with Elmer," he said, voice steady despite everything, "is the reason Juniper has 2 people who love each other and love her without reservation, instead of 2 people locked in the same Cold War that raised us. My brother and her mother tried to build something out of that war, and it cost them everything. I am not going to let fear of gossip cost my niece the one thing they actually succeeded at giving her. A family that chose love over hatred." Judge Alvarez listened to all of it with the same tired patience I remembered from 6 months earlier, and when she finally spoke, she didn't waste words. "I want to be very clear," she said, looking directly at Garrick Marshall, "that a romantic relationship between 2 responsible adult guardians, entered into honestly and conducted with the child's welfare visibly at the center of every decision I've reviewed in these reports, is not grounds for revoking custody in this state. If anything, the reports I've received from the child's pediatrician and from the court-appointed counselor describe a remarkably secure, well-adjusted infant cared for by 2 guardians who communicate well and clearly prioritize her needs above their own conflicts. I see no destabilization here. I see the opposite. Petition for modification denied." Garrick Marshall's face went the color of old ash. Frank's shoulders dropped in visible relief, and when he turned to find me in the gallery, the look on his face was something I would carry with me for the rest of my life. Pure unguarded gratitude, and underneath it, love so plain it made my chest ache. But the hearing wasn't the true crisis. The true crisis came 3 days later when Garrick Marshall, furious and humiliated, showed up unannounced at Frank's cottage on the vineyard property while Juniper and I were both there for a handoff and said, in front of his own son and in front of me, that Frank had a choice to make. His inheritance, the vineyard he'd worked his whole life to earn a place in, or a ball. He would not fund both. He would not have his family name attached to both. I have never in my life seen a silence stretch as long as the one that followed those words. Frank looked at his father, and I watched 30 years of quiet obedience visibly crack across his face, replaced by something fierce and final. I already made that choice, he said, the night I decided I wasn't going to let fear keep me from loving someone the way Des loved Ren. You can keep the vineyard. You can keep the name if that's what you think it's worth more than your granddaughter's happiness. I'm not choosing between them again. I already chose. Garrick Marshall left without another word, and the door shut behind him hard enough to rattle the windows, and Frank stood there in the sudden quiet, breathing hard, looking at me like he was waiting to see if I would run from the wreckage he'd just made of his own life for my sake. I crossed the room and kissed him instead, slow and certain, with Juniper watching from her playmat with the wide, unbothered curiosity of a baby who had no idea her whole world had just tilted, permanently, toward something better. The weeks after Garrick's ultimatum were hard in a way I hadn't fully prepared for, even after everything. Frank moved out of the vineyard cottage entirely rather than live under his father's roof on his father's terms, and for a while he stayed with me and my grandmother, which turned out to be its own strange education. I watched my grandmother, stubborn as bedrock, slowly soften toward the man she'd once have called an enemy, on principle, mostly through the unromantic daily proof of him fixing the leaking gutter over the porch without being asked. Learning her recipe for the apple butter. Ren used to love sitting up late with Juniper on the nights when teething made her inconsolable so that I could finally sleep. He's steadier than I expected, my grandmother admitted to me one evening, watching through the kitchen window as Frank walked slow circles around the yard with Juniper against his shoulder, humming something low and tuneless to settle her. I always pictured Marshalls as reckless. Your sister certainly found a reckless one. Desmond might have been reckless, I said. Frank isn't. Frank is the one who stayed and held everything together, same as I did. I think that's part of why we understand each other. She was quiet for a long moment, her weathered hands wrapped around a mug of cooling tea. Your sister used to say the two families were more alike than either side wanted to admit, she said finally. I told her that was nonsense. I'm starting to think she was right, and I was too proud and too hurt to see it. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was as close as my grandmother had ever come to one, and I took it for the gift it was. Frank's estrangement from his father didn't heal so easily, or so quickly. Garrick Marshall kept his distance through the rest of that spring, cold and formal, at the few family functions he couldn't avoid, and I watched Frank carry that absence like a low, constant ache, present under everything else, even on our best days. But he never once let it become regret. Not for me. Not for the life we were building, awkward and improvised, out of two feuding houses and one small girl who was slowly, unknowingly, stitching them back together. There was a harder night before the turning point arrived, one I don't like to dwell on but can't honestly leave out either, because love that never stumbles isn't the kind that means anything. It happened in late spring, a few weeks before Garrick's ultimatum had fully settled into the quiet ache we'd learned to carry it as. Frank came to pick up Juniper for his week, and found me on the porch with a man named Theo, an old friend from agricultural college who'd stopped by unannounced to talk about a shared irrigation project for the orchard. Nothing more, though. I understood looking back exactly how it must have looked from the driveway. Frank's face closed over the way it used to in the earliest days, before either of us had learned to trust the other with anything soft. I didn't realize you had company, he said, and his voice had gone careful in a way that had nothing to do with kindness. Theo's an old friend, I said, standing too quickly, feeling suddenly, absurdly guilty for a conversation about ditch maintenance. We were talking about the irrigation line, that's all. Frank didn't argue. That was almost worse. He simply gathered Juniper's things with quick, efficient movements, said a polite goodbye to Theo that didn't quite reach his eyes, and left without the easy warmth that had become our ordinary weather together. I stood on the porch after his truck disappeared down the drive and felt something cold settle in my stomach, the particular dread of watching a fragile thing crack without yet knowing how deep the crack ran. I drove to the Vineyard Cottage that same night, uninvited, and found Frank sitting alone at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold in front of him, Juniper already asleep in the next room. "I'm not angry about Theo," he said, before I could speak, staring at his hands instead of at me. "I know there's nothing there. I know you. I trust you. That's not what tonight was about." "Then what was it about?" I asked, gentler than I felt, pulling out the chair across from him. Frank was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone rough in a way that told me we'd finally arrived at something true. "My whole life, I've been the one who gets left holding things together while everyone else gets to have what they want," he said. "Des got to be reckless and loved for it. My father got to have his golden son and his steady son, and never once had to choose between them until it was too late to matter. And for 1 second tonight, seeing you laughing with someone easy and unburdened by any of this, I thought, there it is. That's what it would have looked like if I'd never come along and dragged all of this old grief and feuding into your life. I thought maybe you'd be happier without it, without me." Frank. I reached across the table and took his hand, waiting until he finally lifted his eyes to mine. "I have never once, not for a single second since that hospital nursery, wished for an easier version of this that didn't include you in it. You didn't drag grief into my life. You walked into a life that was already drowning in it, and you stayed anyway, every single week, even when your own father made you pay for it. That isn't a burden I'm tolerating. That's the best thing that has happened to me since I lost my sister." Frank's composure finally broke quiet and unguarded, and I came around the table to hold him while he let himself feel, for once, the fear he'd apparently been carrying alone for weeks, that he was somehow the harder, heavier half of what we were building together. We stayed like that a long time, and when we finally spoke again, it was to promise each other something simple but not small, that the next time an old fear reared up, wearing whatever disguise it chose, we would say it out loud to each other, instead of letting it curdle into silence. It was a promise we kept imperfectly, the way most honest promises are kept, but we kept trying, and trying, it turned out, was most of what love actually required. The turning point came properly a few weeks later, as I suppose it often does, from the person too young to know she was doing anything remarkable at all. Juniper's first birthday fell on a bright, impossibly blue day in early summer, and Frank and I decided after weeks of careful negotiation to hold it at the fence line itself. The exact spot where handoffs had once happened in wary silence, now strung with paper lanterns and a single folding table loaded with more cake than one baby could ever hope to eat. We invited both families. My grandmother came, of course, standing a little stiffly near the punch bowl but present, willing. Frank's mother came too, tearful and hopeful in a way that told me she'd been waiting a long time for permission to hope. Garrick Marshall almost didn't come at all. He arrived late, standing at the edge of the gathering in a suit too formal for a backyard birthday party, watching from a distance with an expression I couldn't read. I watched Frank see him watch the flicker of old hurt cross his face before he set his jaw and simply kept moving through the party, refusing to let his father's presence or absence dictate the shape of this particular afternoon. It was Juniper who closed the distance neither man could bring himself to close on his own. She had just started taking her first unsteady, determined steps that week, the kind of wobbling, triumphant stagger that makes every adult in the room drop what they're doing to watch, and in the middle of the party. Cake smeared across her face, she launched herself away from my grandmother's steadying hands and went stumbling in a wide, wandering arc, straight toward the one stranger standing at the edge of everything. Garrick Marshall went very still as his granddaughter crashed into his legs, grabbing 2 fistfuls of his formal trousers to keep her balance, looking up at him with the same open, unguarded delight she gave everyone, because she had not yet learned, and might never learn if the rest of us did our jobs right, that this man was supposed to be an enemy. I watched something in Garrick Marshall's face come apart entirely. He knelt down slow and stiff and picked her up with hands that shook and held her against his chest while she patted his cheek with sticky cake-covered fingers, babbling something that wasn't quite words yet, but sounded unmistakably like joy. Frank crossed the yard to stand beside his father, and I watched the two of them look at each other over the small girl between them, and I watched 100 years of inherited grievance finally, quietly, begin to lay itself down. "She has your mother's eyes," Garrick said, voice rough, not looking away from Juniper's face. "She has all of us in her," Frank answered. "That's rather the point, isn't it? That's what Des was trying to tell you, the whole time you refused to listen." Garrick Marshall didn't apologize that day, not in words, but he stayed for the rest of the party, and when it came time to sing, his voice joined everyone else's, a little rough, a little uncertain, but present. And when he finally left, he paused beside me at the gate, Juniper handed back into my arms, and said only, "Take care of my son," before walking back across the fence line that no longer felt like a border between enemy nations. Only a line in the grass that a small girl had crossed 100 times that afternoon, without once understanding why anyone had ever thought it mattered. That night, after the last lantern had burned down and Juniper had finally exhaustedly fallen asleep between exhaustion and cake, Frank and I sat together on the porch steps with our hands loosely tangled, watching fireflies rise up out of the grass at the fence line like the whole valley was exhaling something it had been holding for 100 years. "I keep thinking about that letter," I said quietly. "The one your brother never finished, where he wrote to her, to Juniper, about trusting you to make sure she grew up knowing both families loved her without condition." "I think about it every day," Frank admitted. "I think we did it," I said. "I think we actually did the thing he asked." Frank turned to look at me, and in the porch light, his eyes were soft and bright, and something in his expression made my heart trip over itself, the way it still did even now, even after months of loving him. "We're not finished doing it," he said. "I don't think this is a thing you finish. I think it's a thing you keep choosing. Every day. The same way our families chose the opposite for 100 years. "Then I choose it," I said. "Every day, for as long as you'll let me." He reached into his jacket pocket, then slow and almost shy in a way that didn't match the steady, careful man I'd come to know so well, and pulled out a small ring, plain and unadorned. The kind of thing a person picks out with trembling hands and no clear plan beyond the certainty underneath it all. "I wasn't going to do this tonight," he admitted, laughing a little, nervous in a way that undid me completely. "I've had it for 3 weeks. I kept waiting for the right moment, and then Juniper walked across that fence line today like it was nothing, like there was never a war there at all. And I thought, if she can do that without even trying, I can certainly manage to ask the man I love to marry me." I didn't say anything for a moment, too full of feeling to trust my own voice, and Frank's face flickered with sudden uncertainty, like he'd misread everything. "Elmer," he started, "if it's too soon, or if this feels like too much on top of everything else this year has already." "Yes," I said, cutting him off before he could talk himself out of the question. "Frank, yes. 1,000 times yes." The sound he made then, somewhere between a laugh and something rawer, more overwhelmed, was one I would remember for the rest of my life. He slid the ring onto my finger with hands that shook, and then he kissed me there on the porch steps, under a sky gone soft and violet with the last of the evening, and somewhere behind us, through the open window, I could hear Juniper's monitor crackling with the small, contented sounds of a baby sleeping soundly in a house finally fully at peace. We were married the following autumn, in the grove between the two properties, under a canopy of trees just beginning to turn gold, in the exact spot where Wren and Desmond had once stolen their secret hours together. It felt right to marry there, to take the place that had once been a hiding spot for forbidden love and turn it, deliberately, into a place where love no longer needed to hide from anyone. My grandmother walked me partway down the makeshift aisle of scattered wildflowers, her hand steady in mine despite everything it had cost her to arrive at this particular piece. Garrick Marshall stood beside his son, as best man, still stiff in his formality, still learning the shape of tenderness after so many decades without it, but present, undeniably present. Weeping openly by the time Frank turned to watch me walk toward him. Juniper, 18 months old and utterly unbothered by the significance of the day, toddled down the aisle ahead of me in a small white dress scattering flower petals with more enthusiasm than accuracy. Delighted by the attention of two families who had finally fully become one family around her. I looked at Frank Marshall standing beneath that canopy of golden leaves in the grove where our siblings had first fallen in love against every rule they'd been given, and I thought about the letter that had started it all. Still smelling faintly of lavender and grief in the box where I kept it along with all of Wren's other letters, and all of Desmond's unfinished ones. I thought about how 100 years of careful inherited hatred had been undone in the end, not by a grand gesture or a court order, but by a small girl who had never learned there was anything to hate in the first place, and by two men who had loved her enough to learn that lesson from her instead of teaching her their own old wounds. I, Elmer, take you, Frank, I said, when it came time for the vows, my voice steadier than I expected, not because our families chose this for us, but because, in spite of everything they chose against us, I would choose you anyway, every single day. The way you've already been choosing me since the night you drove 20 minutes over the speed limit for a baby's fever and stayed to hold my hand until the sun came up. Frank's eyes were wet, his voice rough when it came his turn. Frank, take you, Elmer, because my brother spent his whole short life trying to build a bridge between two families who wouldn't stop fighting long enough to let him finish it, and because somehow, impossibly, you and I finished it for him. I take you because loving you feels like the truest thing I've ever done, and because our daughter deserves to grow up in a world where love is allowed to win, even against 100 years of people insisting it couldn't. When we kissed beneath that golden canopy, the whole gathered crowd of Falls and Marshalls erupted into applause that shook loose the last of the autumn leaves, and I swear I felt in that moment something like my sister's laughter riding the wind through the grove, something like Desmond's steady approval settling over his brother's shoulders, something like an old tired grudge finally gratefully laying itself down to rest. We built our life in the space between the two properties. After that, a house raised with lumber from both the orchard and the vineyard, standing exactly on the old fence line that no longer marked a border between enemies. Only the meeting place of two families who had finally learned, through the fierce, uncomplicated love of one small girl, that the things we inherit are never as permanent as the things we choose. Juniper grew up knowing both sides of that fence as equally hers. She grew up climbing apple trees on my grandmother's land and learning to prune vines on her grandfather Garrick's, who softened year by year into the kind of grandfather who kept peppermints in his coat pocket and let her ride on his shoulders through the rows of grapevines calling out nonsense songs about the harvest. She grew up with two fathers who loved each other openly, without apology, in a valley that had once demanded silence and shame from people who loved the wrong family. And she grew up never once understanding why anyone would have thought love needed permission to exist in the first place. We planted a tree the week Juniper turned 5, a single sapling right on the old fence line, half its roots reaching into what had once been ball soil and half into what had once been Marshall soil. And we told her when she was old enough to understand it properly that the tree was hers, that it belonged to both sides at once the same way she did, and that nothing in this world was required to choose only one side of anything if love was patient enough to grow it whole. She used to climb that tree every summer, scraping her knees laughing at both of us when we called up for her to be careful. And I would watch her from the porch with Frank's arm around my shoulders and think that exactly this, was the ending Wren had been reaching for when she folded that first letter around a key that didn't fit any lock I owned. Some nights, when the house is quiet and Frank's breathing has gone slow and even beside me, I take out that first letter, worn soft now from handling, and I read my sister's looping, hurried handwriting one more time. I'm happy. I'm scared. I want you to know both of those things are true at once, and I want you to know I don't regret a single moment of loving him, whatever it costs. It cost her everything, in the end. It cost Desmond everything, too. But out of that cost came Juniper, and out of Juniper came Frank standing on the other side of a hospital nursery window with his brother's jaw and his mother's eyes, watching me hold the one thing that would end a war neither of us had started and neither of us had ever wanted. I fold the letter back into its envelope, careful, the way you handle something sacred, and I turn to look at my husband sleeping beside me, at the ring on my own hand catching the thin edge of moonlight through the curtains at the sound of our daughter's steady breathing through the baby monitor on the nightstand between us. Their families had been enemies for generations, but the baby, exactly the way both her parents had hoped, had ended all of that and given the rest of us, the ones left behind, to grieve and to choose. A love story of our very own to finish in her place. I would not, given every chance in the world to change it, choose any differently. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.